Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. And this time, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different.
Yeah, something a little bit out there.
Compressed air engines.
Compressed air engines, yeah.
Now, we've got a couple of interesting sources on this one.
Yeah, we've got one from a channel called Electric, and they're all about electric vehicles. And then,
As you might expect.
As you might expect.
From the name.
But then we've got one from Petrolped, who's, really into cars in general, and particularly into sort of the more internal combustion side of things.
Right. Yeah, and I like Petrolped because he always brings up some interesting points. You know, he's not just a cheerleader for one technology or another. He's willing to kind of look at the pros and cons of everything.
Yeah, he's got a good perspective.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see what they both have to say about this compressed air engine idea.
Yeah, because it kind of seems like it's a technology that could potentially disrupt both, the internal combustion engine market and the EV market.
Yeah, that's right, because it's got some advantages over both.
Right.
So yeah, it's a real wild card.
Okay, so I guess the first question is, like, how do these things even work? I mean, I get the basic idea. You compress air and you use that to push pistons, but
yeah, it seems so simple.
It seems almost too good to be true.
Yeah, well, think about it this way. Have you ever used a bicycle pump?
Sure.
And notice how it gets hot when you're pumping up a tire.
Yeah.
That's because you're compressing air. You're storing energy in that compressed air.
Okay.
And a compressed air engine basically takes that principle and scales it way up.
Okay.
It uses that stored energy to drive pistons just like a gasoline engine, but without the combustion.
So no explosions, just a whoosh of air.
Exactly.
And this isn't some newfangled idea either, is it? I mean, Electric mentioned that compressed air vehicles have been around for like over a century, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Back in the 1800s, they were using compressed air engines for things like mining locomotives and trams.
Wow.
They were reliable, but they had some pretty big limitations in terms of power and range.
So that's why they never really took off.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, but now we've got GM, this giant car company, saying they've figured out how to overcome those limitations.
Yeah, they're doing some really interesting research with high-pressure air tanks and some pretty clever engineering.
Yeah, they were talking about using the car's chassis itself as part of the air storage system.
Yeah, that's a really innovative idea because it lets them maximize storage volume without sacrificing passenger or cargo space.
So they're basically turning the whole car into a giant air tank.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's pretty wild.
It is.
Okay, so we've got the basics down, but now the big question is why? Why even bother with compressed air when everyone seems to be going crazy for electric vehicles?
Well, there are actually some pretty compelling reasons, and Electric lays out a bunch of them.
Right.
Well, for starters, compressed air engines are completely pollution-free at the point of use.
Okay.
No tailpipe emissions whatsoever.
Right.
And unlike EVs, they don't rely on rare earth metals, which are often mined in environmentally sensitive areas.
Yeah, that's a good point, because battery production does have some environmental downsides.
Definitely.
And then there's the cost factor. Electric claims that compressed air vehicles could be significantly cheaper to produce than both gasoline and electric cars.
And that makes sense because they have fewer moving parts than traditional engines, and they don't require those complex and expensive battery systems that EVs do.
So potentially a win for both the environment and your wallet.
Here at MindMeld XL, we believe our best future will rely on a fusion of man and machine. Subscribe to the channel to follow our journey.
Okay, but here's where I get skeptical. If compressed air is so great, why haven't we seen these cars on the road already? What's the catch?
Well, the catch is those historical limitations we talked about earlier, low power, limited range, and safety concerns.
Yeah, those are some pretty big hurdles to overcome.
Definitely.
I mean, I remember reading somewhere that early compressed air vehicles could barely go 100 miles on a single fill-up.
Yeah, and then there's the whole issue of having pressurized tanks in a car accident.
That's a little unnerving to think about.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't want one of those things exploding on you.
No, definitely not.
But to be fair to GM, they are addressing those concerns.
How so?
Well, they're using advanced materials like high-strength composites for the air tanks,
Okay.
which are much lighter and more resistant to damage than traditional steel.
So they're less likely to rupture in a crash?
Exactly. And their chassis integration strategy also helps to distribute the pressure more evenly, which reduces the risk of catastrophic failure.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the power issue? Can a puff of air really compete with a roaring V8 engine or even a zippy electric motor?
That's a fair question. And torque has always been a challenge for compressed air engines.
Right, because you need that twisting force to get the car moving.
It's exactly. But GM claims that their prototypes are already achieving performance figures comparable to gasoline-powered cars. They're focusing on everyday driving, not necessarily winning drag races.
Okay, so maybe not for the speed demons, but potentially viable for the average commute.
Right.
But hold on, what about longer trips? Would you need to stop every 100 miles to refill your air tank?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, because that would be a major inconvenience.
For sure. And it all comes down to range and refueling time.
Yeah.
If it takes just a few minutes to top off your compressed air tank,
Yeah.
and you can go 300 or 400 miles on a single fill, then it starts to become a lot more appealing.
Yeah, I can see that.
But that's a big if.
It is. And speaking of challenges, electric also brought up the case of Peugeot, the French car company.
Oh, yeah. What about them?
Well, apparently they were working on a compressed air hybrid, which sounded really cool.
A hybrid.
Yeah, compressed air hybrid, but then they just scrapped the whole project.
That's interesting.
Makes you wonder why.
Yeah. Were there technical roadblocks they couldn't overcome? Or were there other factors at play?
Yeah, it starts to feel a little conspiratorial at that point.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Especially when you consider the story of Stanley Meyer, the guy who claimed to invent a car that ran on water.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about him.
He ended up dying under some pretty mysterious circumstances after meeting with potential investors. It makes you wonder if there are powerful interests out there that would actively try to suppress any technology that threatens their profits.
Yeah, it's certainly possible, but we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions without any concrete evidence.
Right, of course. But it's definitely something to think about.
It is.
Okay, so we've got this intriguing situation where on the one hand, we have GM betting big on compressed air, but on the other hand, there are these hints of potential pushback from powerful forces who might not want to see this technology succeed.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic.
It is, and now I want to bring in the perspective from Petroped because he takes a broader look at the push for EVs and the potential consequences.
Okay, that should be interesting.
Yeah, he seems to be a bit skeptical about the whole EV revolution.
Yeah, he does raise some valid points about the challenges of widespread EV adoption, especially with those 2035 EV mandates looming on the horizon.
Right. He argues that these mandates are forcing car manufacturers to prioritize EVs, even if other viable alternative fuel technologies like compressed air might be worth exploring.
And he's not alone in that concern. A lot of experts believe that a one-size-fits-all approach to the future of transportation might not be the best solution.
Yeah, and Petroped specifically points out that EVs have some significant drawbacks.
Here at MindMeld XL, we believe our best future will rely on a fusion of man and machine. Subscribe to the channel to follow our journey.
Like what?
Well, for starters, they're still expensive. Even with more affordable models hitting the market, the initial cost of an EV is significantly higher than a comparable gasoline-powered car.
Yeah, that's true.
And he brings up the issue of depreciation. Apparently, EVs lose their value much faster than traditional cars.
Yeah, that's a major deterrent for a lot of potential buyers.
And then there's the whole charging infrastructure situation. While charging stations are becoming more common, they're still not as ubiquitous as gas stations.
Right, and even with fast chargers, it can take a lot longer to fuel up an EV than it does to fill a gas tank.
Yeah, and what about people who live in apartments or don't have access to dedicated charging stations at home? Owning an EV is just not practical for them.
Exactly, and that's why Petroped advocates for a more diverse mix of technologies, including hybrids, hydrogen fuel cells, and synthetic fuels alongside EVs.
Yeah, he seems particularly bullish on hydrogen, arguing that it's a much more practical solution for certain applications like heavy trucking and long-haul transportation.
Right.
He even makes a case for synthetic fuels despite the challenges of scalability.
Interesting.
Yeah, he points out that the existing infrastructure for gasoline and diesel vehicles could easily be adapted to synthetic fuels, which could be a viable option for certain sectors like motorsport.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So where does this leave compressed air? If EVs aren't the only answer, and Petroped is pushing for a more diverse approach, could compressed air carve out a niche for itself in this future transportation landscape?
That's the question we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve deeper into the potential for compressed air engines to coexist and even compete with other alternative fuel technologies.
Stay tuned, because this is where things get really interesting. We're just getting started.
It's almost like they're both coming at it from these opposite ends of the spectrum. You know,
Yeah.
you've got the EV enthusiast and then the internal combustion, fan.
But they're both kind of arriving at the same conclusion, which is
Yeah.
that we need to be thinking more broadly about
it's-
sustainable transportation.
It's not just about one technology or the other.
It's not going to be a magic bullet. And I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about PetrolPed is that he's always emphasizing that, we need to look at the whole picture, the whole life cycle of these technologies.
Yeah, we can't just focus on the tailpipe emissions. We have to think about,
Right.
Where are the materials coming from? What's the environmental impact of manufacturing? And what happens to these things at the end of their life?
Especially like with batteries.
Exactly.
He was really hitting on that point about
Yeah,
the mining of these rare earth minerals.
Yeah, and that's a huge issue with EV battery production.
Huge.
I mean, it's sort of trying to make it more sustainable, but it's still a major environmental concern.
Right.
And that's one area where compressed air could potentially have an advantage.
At least from a manufacturing standpoint.
Right, because it doesn't rely on those rare earth metals.
But then we have to think about, okay, well, where's the energy coming from to compress the air in the first place?
That's a good point.
If it's coming from fossil fuels, then are we really achieving zero emissions?
Yeah, that's the key. If compressed air is going to be truly sustainable, that energy has to come from renewable sources.
Like solar or wind?
Huh.
I can just imagine, pulling up to a compressed air filling station and it's got this giant solar array on the roof.
That's the dream right there.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the potential for synergy between different clean technologies.
Right.
You could even have hybrid systems that combine compressed air with a small, super efficient internal combustion engine, or even a fuel cell to extend the range.
So you could have a car that runs primarily on compressed air for your daily commute, but then kicks in a secondary power source for longer trips.
Exactly.
That would be pretty appealing to a lot of drivers.
Yeah, the flexibility would be huge.
Huge.
And that's the beauty of a diverse approach. You can tailor solutions to specific needs and driving patterns.
Right.
Not everyone needs a vehicle that can tow a boat or drive across the country on a single tank.
And PetrolPed really hammers home that point that, trying to force everyone into a single type of vehicle, whether it's an EV or something else, just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, one size fits all doesn't work in this situation.
Not at all.
And that's where I think compressed air could really shine.
You think so?
Yeah, I mean, it might not be the best solution for every situation, but it could be a fantastic option for city driving short commutes delivery services.
Okay.
Especially if they can build out the refueling infrastructure.
Right. Yeah, that's going to be key.
It is.
So, okay, we've talked about the pros and cons, the potential benefits and the challenges, but let's get down to brass tacks. Is compressed air a realistic contender in the future of transportation, or is it just a pipe dream?
That's a tough question.
It is.
I mean, I think it has the potential to be a significant player.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe not as dominant as EVs or traditional gasoline-powered cars.
Right.
But certainly is a viable option in the mix.
Okay.
But we can't ignore the potential for resistance from those who might see compressed air as a threat.
To their bottom line.
Right.
I keep thinking back to that story about Stanley Meyer and his water-powered car. It just makes you wonder if there are forces out there that would actively try to suppress any technology that threatens their profits.
Yeah, it's natural to be skeptical, especially when you're dealing with something as disruptive as this.
Right.
But at the same time, we can't let skepticism turn into paranoia.
Right. Of course not.
We have to focus on the facts, the science, the potential of the technology itself.
Okay, so let's say for the sake of argument that compressed air does have what it takes to break through.
Okay.
What needs to happen to take it from a promising concept to a reality on the road?
Well, I think continued innovation is crucial.
Like what?
Companies like GM need to keep pushing the boundaries, extending the range, boosting performance, and making the refueling process as seamless as possible.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking questions.
See you next time.